30 days ago, I did something I had been putting off for 3 years, and I gave myself exactly one rule before I did it. I deleted Windows from my main machine, installed Linux, and refused to give myself an exit. Not a browser version of anything, not a close enough alternative, not a Windows virtual machine quietly running in the background as a safety net I could fall back on the moment something broke. I wanted an honest answer, with no softening, to a question that keeps a huge number of people locked inside an operating system they increasingly resent. Can someone who actually depends on Windows software every single day, not casually, walk away from Microsoft in 2026 and take their entire software stack with them? I picked this exact moment to test it because the pressure behind that question has never been higher. Windows 10 reached its official end of life on October 14th, 2025, and Microsoft's own published requirements mean a genuinely enormous share of the existing PC install base does not meet Windows 11's hardware bar. TPM 2.0, mandatory secure boot, and a hard processor generation cutoff that excludes machines that were premium hardware just a few years earlier. Millions of computers that still work perfectly fine are being told they are obsolete by the exact company that sold them, and the fix Microsoft keeps steering people toward isn't a software patch. It's a purchase. Buy a new machine. That is precisely the moment a lot of people start asking whether there's another option, and Linux keeps coming up in that search. Then they open a browser tab, land on half a forum post written 4 years ago, read a single sentence claiming their software won't work, and close the idea completely. I wanted to know if that forum post is still telling the truth in 2026, because a claim that was accurate in 2021 isn't automatically still accurate today, and nobody seemed to be actually testing it. So before I reformatted a single drive, I sat down and built a list, and I was deliberate about what went on it. Not a curated set of apps I already suspected would work, cherry-picked to make a point. The actual complete list of every Windows application I had personally opened in the previous 2 weeks of real working life. The heavy ones I use constantly. The obscure niche utilities that do exactly one job and have no obvious substitute. The boring background tools nobody ever mentions in a video like this because there's nothing exciting to say about them. That list became my scorecard. Split into exactly 2 columns, worked and did not work, with no room for a third option. I made myself one promise going in. No moving something from the failed column into the worked column because it almost functioned, and no counting a web-based substitute as a win when what I was actually testing was whether the real Windows executable ran. Either I could do the specific task I needed with it, or I couldn't, and the result went in the column it earned. Before any of those results make sense, you need to understand the piece of software making this entire experiment possible, because getting the mental model wrong here means misreading everything that follows. It's called Wine, and the project has existed since 1993, which makes it genuinely older than a meaningful share of the people who will watch this video. What Wine actually does is translate the instructions a Windows application sends toward the operating system into the equivalent instructions Linux understands, live as the program is actually running. It is not an emulator, and it is not a simulator pretending to be Windows underneath. It's a real-time translation layer, and that distinction carries enormous practical weight for performance, because there's no virtual hardware layer eating your CPU cycles in the background. The application is a genuine, native process running directly on your machine the entire time. My test setup was deliberately unglamorous. A mid-range machine, nothing exotic or particularly new, roughly the exact kind of hardware. Windows 11's own requirements would force you to replace to keep running officially supported. I installed Ubuntu 24.04 LTS as the base, added a tool called Bottles through Flatpak to manage the Wine environments, and started working down my list one application at a time. Let me start with the category carrying the most anxiety for most people, because it's the one I was most nervous about myself. Microsoft Office. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say it worked, since the internet is full of vague, here's my honest experience posts that don't specify anything concrete. I was running older desktop Office builds, the kind of standalone installer that predates the full Microsoft 365 click-to-run architecture Microsoft ships by default today. Word opened cleanly, documents rendered correctly, fonts loaded properly, and formatting held together across repeated saves and reopens without corrupting anything. Excel opened just as cleanly, and standard spreadsheets with formulas, named ranges, and basic pivot tables calculated exactly as expected for the kind of work an ordinary person actually does day to day. It held together noticeably better than the platform's reputation would lead you to expect. Recent compatibility testing backs this up, with Word and Excel from recent Office builds landing among the most stable results in the entire database, and even some older .NET framework-dependent applications that used to require extensive tweaking, now working with minimal configuration. That said, there's a real ceiling. The moment you push into heavily macro-driven workbooks, VBA scripts calling external libraries, or tightly integrated multi-app Office pipelines, the picture changes noticeably for the worse. UT for the ordinary use case, which is genuinely where most people actually live day to day, it held up far better than the platform's negative reputation suggests it should in 2026. The next result caught me off guard more than anything else in the entire month, and it happens to be the category that matters most to a large and rapidly growing share of the people asking this exact question: developer tools. If you write code for a living, or even seriously as a hobby, the experience running Windows developer software on Linux through Wine is almost startlingly smooth. Visual Studio Code ran nearly flawlessly across the full month. Not close to flawless, nearly flawless. The core editing experience, the extension ecosystem, the integrated terminal, and Git integration all behaved exactly as if nothing about the underlying platform had changed at all. Several smaller utilities I rely on for specific parts of my own workflow installed without a single hiccup, and ran without ever producing an error I had to sit down and troubleshoot. This makes a certain kind of sense once you actually think about why. Developer tools are frequently built with cross-platform awareness baked into their architecture from day one, because the people writing them often work across several operating systems themselves, as a matter of course. The uncomfortable point worth making directly to anyone staying on Windows specifically because of their development environment is this: that particular justification is measurably weaker than most people currently assume. The friction in this entire category was close to zero for me across 30 days of daily use. Then there's a category that almost never comes up in these comparisons because on the surface it's genuinely boring. Small, single-purpose Windows utilities, the little tools that do exactly one job, a file conversion utility, a specialized viewer, an older piece of niche software with no modern replacement and no official Linux port anywhere. Nobody makes a video specifically about these because there's nothing dramatic to say about them. They either work or they don't. In my own experience, the quiet, unglamorous truth is that most of them worked. Not every single one, but a clear majority of the small utility software I threw at Bottles over the month simply installed and ran without complaint. Bottles lets a user install ready-made environments tailored to different use cases, gaming, software development, or general productivity work, and it abstracts away most of the complexity of manual Wine prefix management behind a clean graphical interface. That abstraction is doing genuinely meaningful work under the hood. Getting a temperamental older Windows utility running used to mean digging through a 12-year-old form thread and manually editing configuration files by hand. With Bottles, that process has been compressed down into a handful of interface decisions inside a graphical menu. That's a meaningful, practical change, specifically for the kind of user who isn't a longtime Linux veteran but is willing to put in a reasonable amount of effort. Now let's talk about gaming, because it carries its own layer of outdated mythology. And the actual data in 2026 tells a genuinely specific story worth stating plainly. Compatibility tracking from ProtonDB, aggregated by independent trackers, put the figure at roughly 89.7% of tested Windows titles launching on Linux in some functional form, with a meaningful chunk of new releases earning perfect, no tweaks needed compatibility ratings straight out of the gate. Proton, which is Valve's own compatibility layer built directly on top of Wine and integrated straight into Steam, has been transforming this entire space for years now, driven heavily by ongoing investment tied to the Steam Deck. On the hardware side, AMD GPUs frequently hit performance parity with Windows and sometimes exceed it, because the open source Mesa Vulkan drivers are heavily tuned specifically for the kind of DXVK translation workloads Proton depends on. NVIDIA GPUs sit at a steadier, still very playable, 10 to 15% performance overhead through Proton, varying somewhat by title, and games built with native Vulkan rendering paths frequently run every bit as fast on Linux as they do on Windows, sometimes faster. What that means practically is this: if you've been telling yourself you can't leave Windows because of your game library, you need to actually check your specific library against current compatibility data rather than relying on a theoretical problem you remember from years ago. For single-player titles, open-world games, indie titles, and anything without kernel-level anti-cheat baked in, the experience through Proton in 2026 is genuinely comparable to running the same title on Windows. The gap that used to feel like an actual wall has shrunk, for most games, down to something closer to a rounding error. I ran several titles I had been playing regularly on Windows before the switch, and the performance difference sat comfortably within the margin a frame rate counter would call statistical noise. Load times matched, stability matched. In a couple of cases, running an AMD GPU specifically, I was actually getting cleaner, more consistent frame times on Linux than I had been getting on the exact same hardware under Windows, likely thanks to fewer background process interruptions and less scheduler overhead from the constant telemetry and update checking. Windows runs in the background, whether you want it to or not. Adobe Creative Cloud tells a more complicated and genuinely newsworthy story, and I want to walk through exactly what changed rather than repeating outdated pessimism. The Adobe Creative Cloud installer had been fundamentally broken under Wine since 2018 due to its reliance on old embedded Internet Explorer components that Wine's compatibility layer never fully supported. In January 2026, an independent developer released a set of patches specifically targeting two subsystems, MSXML3 and MSHTML, the pieces responsible for rendering the HTML and JavaScript that power the installer's own graphical interface, and those patches finally unlocked a direct installation path for Photoshop 2021 and Photoshop 2025, without needing to manually copy files over from an existing Windows machine first. Those patches haven't been merged into mainline Wine yet, but they're openly available, and running them, Photoshop launches roughly 40% faster than it did under the previous major Wine release, with noticeably better brush responsiveness during actual editing work. It is not, however, a complete solution. Neural filters, several GPU-accelerated features, and certain specific rendering functions remain in various states of partial or broken functionality. For someone who uses Photoshop occasionally for light editing work, that may already be functional enough day to day. For a professional whose entire production pipeline depends on the latest Adobe Creative Cloud release, tight integration between Photoshop, Illustrator, and Premiere, and GPU-accelerated workflows running reliably every single day, this is not yet a working production solution. It's a genuinely promising experiment, and that's a meaningful distinction worth holding on to rather than collapsing into either blind optimism or outdated dismissal. The last major failure category has the least satisfying explanation of the entire month, because the failure isn't technical at all, it's intentional. Specific software that reaches deep into the Windows kernel, certain hardware management utilities, and most frustratingly for a lot of people, a meaningful share of online games protected by kernel-level anti-cheat systems, simply refuse to run, and the reason has nothing to do with Wine's technical capability. Riot's Vanguard anti-cheat, which protects both Valorant and League of Legends, loads at boot time specifically to watch every driver attempting to load into the system from the moment the computer powers on. And it is built to fully and permanently block anything it can't verify as genuine, unmodified Windows, which by design excludes Linux entirely with no opt-in path available at all. It's a business and policy decision made by a specific company, and no amount of clever engineering on the Linux side changes a decision that was never technical to begin with. Now I want to tell you about the single application that fought me hardest, and the fix nobody puts anywhere near the top of the tutorial, because this ended up being the most practically useful thing I learned all month, and the way it's buried in documentation genuinely frustrates me. I spent several full days troubleshooting one specific piece of specialized software for a niche part of my workflow, and I won't name it specifically because the lesson isn't about that one app, it's about the process itself. It would install without issue, reach a certain point in its initialization sequence, and then either freeze completely or throw a generic, unhelpful error. I tried installing every dependency I could think of. I tried different Linux distributions running the exact same underlying Wine build. I read through page after page of old WineHQ compatibility database entries, looking for anyone with the same problem. Nothing worked. The actual fix turned out to be one single drop-down menu inside bottles. Not a terminal command, not a manually edited configuration file, not an obscure missing DLL hunt through a dozen forum posts. I switched that specific application's bottle from the newest Wine version to an older, more thoroughly proven build from the previous major release cycle. The application launched successfully on the first attempt, and has run without a single issue every day since. The design philosophy behind bottles is that specific versions of Wine can genuinely behave better with specific applications, so the ideal setup lets each app run inside its own isolated, independently versioned environment, rather than forcing every program to share one global configuration. That's the key insight most tutorials completely bury. Wine's newest release is, in most respects, the most capable version that exists, but newer isn't automatically better for every application. Some older software was originally built and tested against specific quirks in how the real Windows API behaved at the time, quirks that older Wine versions still emulate more faithfully. When a newer Wine release changes exactly how it handles a certain system call, even in the direction of being more technically correct by Microsoft's own current standards, an application quietly relying on that old behavior can suddenly stop working entirely. Once you know it, the troubleshooting hierarchy inside bottles resolves the overwhelming majority of failures that don't fall into that deliberately blocked category. First, try running it on the newest available Wine version. If that fails, switch the same bottle to the previous stable major release instead. If that still fails, open the Dependencies tab and install the most common Windows runtime components, Visual C++ redistributables, the .NET framework, and core DirectX components. 9 times out of 10, one of those two moves is the entire difference between an application that refuses to launch and one that runs without complaint. Most tutorials mention this step near the bottom, buried under pages of unrelated setup instructions, and that ordering is genuinely backwards for how useful the information actually is. So after 30 days, a complete list of the Windows applications I actually use, split into 2 honest columns with no curved grading and no softening the result to fit a conclusion I wanted going in. Here's the verdict as plainly as I can state it, followed by something I think matters more than any single compatibility result, because it reframes the entire conversation in a way this discussion almost never actually reaches. The majority of what I tested worked. Not everything, and not without occasional friction, but the worked column ended up meaningfully longer than the failed column. And a large share of the items in that failed column failed for reasons that have nothing to do with Linux's actual technical capability. They failed because specific companies made a deliberate business decision to prevent their own software from running anywhere except Windows. Understanding that distinction changes how you should think about the entire problem. So here's the verdict broken down by the groups it actually applies to differently, because one single answer doesn't fit everyone, and pretending otherwise does a disservice to anyone trying to make an informed decision. If you're a developer, writing code, living in terminals, managing repositories, and running build tools, the answer is yes. And in some genuine ways, the Linux environment turned out to be more naturally suited to that specific kind of work than Windows ever was for me. If your work sits entirely inside the current Microsoft 365 desktop ecosystem, heavily macro-driven Excel workbooks shared across a Windows-only team, Outlook as a mission-critical daily workflow hub, SharePoint Sync as a genuine daily operational dependency, the honest answer right now is not yet, and I'm not going to soften that to sound more encouraging than the reality supports. The right path depends heavily on file complexity, your specific collaboration needs, and whether Outlook macros or access are genuinely mandatory for your work. Wine can run plenty of individual Windows applications reliably, but for the complete Microsoft Office desktop suite as part of a demanding daily professional workflow, a dedicated Windows virtual machine is still usually the more predictable choice today. The browser-based version of Office runs excellently inside any Linux browser, and for a lot of everyday tasks, that pathway is genuinely enough on its own. But if you specifically need the full native desktop applications in their current form, be honest with yourself about that before you format anything permanently. And if you're a creative professional whose livelihood runs through the latest full Adobe Creative Cloud release, Photoshop, Illustrator, Premiere, and After Effects as daily production tools built around GPU-accelerated workflows, the answer is also not yet. The experimental wine patches that finally enabled a working Adobe Creative Cloud installation on Linux remain limited to custom, unofficial wine builds, and users should expect manual setup steps and occasionally incomplete behavior along the way. The story is moving in the right direction for the first time in nearly a decade, and that's genuinely significant. But moving in the right direction isn't the same thing as having fully arrived. And your actual production environment is not the right place to be running an open experiment. Now here's the thing I think the entire compatibility discussion consistently misses, and it's the most important observation from the whole 30 days. The question most people ask is whether Linux can run their specific Windows apps. That's the wrong question to be asking in 2026. The right question is, who actually benefits from you continuing to believe it can't? Think seriously about the position you're in if you own a machine that Windows 11 officially refuses to support. You're being told by the exact company that sells the operating system that your existing hardware is now obsolete, and the path they're steering you toward involves either spending real money on new hardware or accepting a recurring subscription model that didn't exist when you originally bought the machine you're still using every day. Distributions like Zorin OS and several others have spent the last year positioning themselves as realistic, accessible alternatives for users genuinely tired of bloat, ads, and telemetry. And that positioning is increasingly backed by real technical progress rather than pure advocacy. The exact machines Windows is actively abandoning are, in a huge number of cases, perfectly capable of running Linux smoothly, and perfectly capable of running the majority of the Windows software those same users depend on every day through tools like wine and bottles. A machine with a mid-range processor, a modest amount of RAM, and an SSD, hardware that fails Microsoft's own Windows 11 checklist outright, runs Linux genuinely well. It runs wine genuinely well. It runs the large majority of the Windows applications an average person actually needs on any given day. The hardware itself was never actually obsolete. The narrative that it's obsolete is the product of a specific business model, not an underlying technical reality. The remaining gating factor holding back broader adoption is increasingly commercial rather than purely technical. The real open question is whether publishers and developers choose to formally validate Linux support, not whether the platform can actually handle the workload, because in most cases, that matter, it clearly already can. That shift in where the problem lives is significant. And when a barrier is purely technical, it's Linux's own problem to solve. When the barrier is commercial and political instead, That's an entirely different conversation, and it means the technology itself has already cleared the bar that used to be the real obstacle. What I came out of these 30 days genuinely believing is that the apps were never really the wall in the first place. The wall was the widespread, mostly untested assumption that the apps were the wall. Most people have simply never tested whether their specific software runs on Linux in 2026. They're operating on a belief formed from something they read years ago, something a friend mentioned once in passing, or an outdated reputation that Linux itself has done a poor job of publicly updating. Actually running the test, building the real list, installing bottles, and pointing it at the exact executable files you personally use takes roughly an afternoon of your time. The result of that single afternoon might tell you something meaningfully different from what you currently believe walking in. I'm not going to sit here and tell you Linux is perfect, because it clearly isn't. The kernel-level anti-cheat wall around certain competitive multiplayer games is real, and it's genuinely a policy problem, far more than a technical one. The Adobe situation is improving in a way that's actually newsworthy, but it isn't yet resolved for demanding professional workflows. The heavily macro-driven Office experience still has a real ceiling I'm not going to pretend away. Those are honest limitations, and they belong in any fair verdict on this topic. But if your own personal software list doesn't heavily depend on those specific categories, the entire question changes shape. It's no longer really a question of whether you technically can leave Windows behind. The data from this month says most people probably can. The real remaining question is whether you actually want to, and what it would genuinely take to find that out for certain. And the honest answer to that second question is roughly one afternoon. One free tool called Bottles. And the real, unfiltered list of applications you personally use, not the list you'd assume in advance would fail, but the actual one sitting on your current machine right now. Drop the one Windows application in the comments that you're personally most convinced would never survive a test like this one. Name it specifically rather than describing it vaguely, because I'm building the next round of testing directly from that list, and I'm going to run every single one of them through the same 30-day process and report back honestly with both columns exactly as they land. No fudging the results either way. Whatever breaks stays visibly broken in the video. That's genuinely the only way any of this is actually worth doing.